Okay, so we're continuing our discussion of the chapters from the Case for Jesus. And today we're going to look at part 1 of what is really the heart of the book, which is the whole question of Jesus' divine identity, the question of Jesus' deity or divinity. Originally, when I wrote the book, I think I already said this to you, I thought I was just going to focus on the origin of the Gospels, just the origin and authorship of the Gospels. But then I realized that as I was putting it together, at least for a general audience book, that it needed to not stop there. It really needed to go beyond that and ask, why is the reliability of the Gospels even an issue? Why does it matter so much? In particular, I wanted to address the question of, are the Gospels reliable when it comes to the question of Jesus' divinity? Right? And so what we're going to do in this session, and then on Thursday as well, is look at those 2 chapters from the book on the divinity of Jesus. So I'm on page 34 of the notes. And the title of this section is, Did Jesus Think He Was God? This is lecture 6 from the book. You might recall from the opening chapter of the book, I started with a little anecdote from C.S. Lewis, who published a very famous book called Mere Christianity in the mid-50s. Anybody read that book? How many of you read Mere Christianity? Wow, okay. That's a real classic. So if you haven't read it, you really should. I'd love to know the number of people who have become Christians because they read Mere Christianity. Oh, so we got 1 in here. All right, good. It's a huge, huge milestone in the history of especially 20th century Christian apologetics. And in the book, Lewis made a very famous argument about the divinity of Christ that continues to be repeated by Christian apologists everywhere. So it's the famous trilemma that Lewis lays out. And he's responding at this point to the claim that's already prevalent in the early 20th century that Jesus was just a good moral teacher or a prophet or a rabbi, but that you don't have to necessarily follow him as the divine Son of God. And so Lewis responded to that argument here with a really famous quote at the top of page 34 that I've given you. And this is what he says, the famous trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord, ? Lewis writes, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, I love this, on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, so British, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend. That's the old British word for devil. And consequently, however strange and terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. All right, that's from Mere Christianity, page 54 to 56. Okay, so what Lewis lays out here is he says, look, Jesus really only gives us 3 options. He's either a man who knew he wasn't God and said he was God, which would, of course, then make him a liar. And not just a liar, in a general common sort of way, but a really big liar, right, of a magnitude that is so grave that you wouldn't be able to follow him as a good teacher, right? So that's the case. So he's not God, but he says he's God. Or he's a lunatic, namely, he thinks he's God, but he isn't. That's our second option. On the level of a man who thinks he's an egg, when in fact he's a man. Although I would actually differ from Lewis in that I would say there's more similarity between a poached egg and a man than there is between a man and God. Right? The distance is greater between God and a man. So this is lunacy of the highest possible degree. Or, third option, Lewis lays out, Jesus claims to be God, he says he's God, and he is who he claims to be. Now that rhetorical move on Lewis's part has been very, very effective in the 20th century as an explanation for embracing the Christian faith, because there are so many people in post-Christian or secularizing Christian West who tend to want to have a positive portrayal of Jesus as a good teacher or a prophet or whatnot, but don't want to embrace him as divine. So this presses the issue that that isn't really an option. You can't really just say he's a good prophet or a great moral teacher. You have to make a choice. All right? But since Lewis published Mere Christianity, see, when he published Mere Christianity in the 50s, he could still write for a British populace that largely regarded the Gospels as historically reliable. Right? But by the time you get to the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the idea that the Gospels aren't reliable has spread widely. And now, as Bart Ehrman puts it in one of his books, there's a fourth option: legend. What does that mean? It means that Jesus never actually claimed to be divine. In other words, not that he was a legend in the sense that he didn't exist, but that the claims about his divinity are legendary claims. That's Ehrman's position. In effect, then, Ehrman does what I believe in football they call an end run. Is that correct? He doesn't run around the other three arguments. Am I wrong? You look at me puzzled. Is that right? No, never mind. It must be some other game. All right. You understand what I'm saying? He's basically skirting the other arguments and ending up with a conclusion that evades their main point by saying, well, Jesus never claimed to be divine anyway, so you don't have to accept him. You got it? All right? Does that make sense? It's really, really important. This is really the heart of why I wrote the book, because Lewis's arguments don't really work then, in that sense, in a 21st century context, where the idea is now becoming more widespread that Jesus never claimed to be divine. Ehrman says here, Jesus probably never called himself God. This means he doesn't have to be either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. He could just be a first century Palestinian Jew who had a message to proclaim other than his divinity. And so what Ehrman's reflecting there in his quote is this, is that the idea now has become that, well, yes, Jesus is divine. He does claim to be divine in the Gospel of John, but the synoptics, he's just a merely human Messiah. He never claims to be God. So in other words, Ehrman's response to Lewis would be, well, Lewis, you're misunderstanding the historical evidence. You're thinking in terms of the Johannine Christ, but you're not looking at the fact that in terms of historical evidence, the three earlier Gospels, the three synoptics, which are earlier, and thereby at least presumably somewhat more reliable, don't have a Jesus who claims to be God. It's only John, right? So the score then is 3 against 1. This is earlier, this is later. This one's Jesus is merely human, this one he's divine. How do we explain the data? Ehrman says, well, it's because the Gospel of John itself isn't reliable. It isn't giving us a reliable portrait of what Jesus of Nazareth actually claimed about himself. It's just telling us what early Christians at the end of the first century thought about Jesus. They're taking divine claims and writing them back and putting them back into Jesus' mouth, putting them onto Jesus' lips. So Lewis's argument is obliterated, if that's the case. And he's right. Lewis's argument doesn't deal with that fourth possibility. It presumes gospel reliability. And if you look at your handout here on page 34, you can see why the case is laid out this way. Because in the Gospel of John, Jesus clearly claims to be divine. I've given you just the two most famous, these are the two most famous sayings here, right? John 8 and John 10. Where the Jews say, are you greater than our father Abraham who died? Who do you claim to be? They ask the question of his identity. So Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. So there we have it. Jesus takes the divine name, I am, ego eimi. This is from Exodus 3, 14 to 15. In the Septuagint, the Greek words are exactly the same. Before Abraham was, I am. He takes the divine name as his own. And he asserts his pre-existence as well as his identity with Yahweh, the God of Israel, who revealed himself to Moses on Mount Sinai. And then again, in John chapter 10, Jesus said, I and the Father are one. How do the Jews respond to that? Oh, great, that you're morally one with God. Or great, you're spiritually one with the Lord. No, they take up stones to stone him. Jesus answered, I've shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? The Jews answer him, we stone you for no good work, but for blasphemy. Because you, being a man, make yourself God. And the Greek word there is theos, right? From which we get theology. Okay? So they recognize that he's claiming to be God by saying, I and the Father are one. But according to Ehrman and others, that's precisely what's missing from the synoptics. In the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus never says before Abraham was, I am. That's only in John. In the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus never says, I and the Father are one. Right? That's only in John. So if the score is really 3 human gospels against 1 divine gospel, then the human gospels win. As Ehrman loves to say in public, because I heard him say it, and as he wrote very emphatically in his book, is Jesus divine in the synoptic gospels? Listen to this quote. This is really, he presses it really hard here. If Jesus went around Galilee, proclaiming himself to be a divine being sent from God, could anything else that he might say be so breathtaking and thunderously important? And yet none of these earlier sources, that would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, although Ehrman says it as Mark, Q, M, and L, because he's reflecting the 2 source, okay? But those are all constructed out of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. None of these earlier sources says any such thing about him. Did they, all of them, just decide not to mention the one thing that was most significant about Jesus? Almost certainly the divine self-claims in John are not historical. So do you feel the force of his argument? You feel the force of the rhetoric there? It's really strong. And again, if he's right about that, then he's got a point. You got 24 chapters in Luke, 28 chapters in Matthew, 16 in Mark, and none of them ever happened to mention that Jesus claimed to be God. Wouldn't that be a good thing to talk about? Okay, so the question becomes, is that right? And the burden of the book, the burden of the case for Jesus, of 2 chapters in it, was to show that that is dead wrong. It's dead wrong. It's just not true. It's a distortion of the evidence. It's misleading because what you're demanding of Jesus is to go around saying in the streets, hey everybody, I'm God. I'm going to die for your sins. Believe in me. Accept me as your personal Lord and Savior, and everything will be okay. That's what you're demanding Jesus to do, which is an anachronistic and unhistorical way to approach it. Because if you look at the Gospels, what you'll see is, yes, Jesus never claims, goes around shouting, I am God, explicitly. But he does claim to be God in a Jewish way. He's not talking to 21st century modern people. He's talking to ancient Jews. And he's also revealing a mystery of great magnitude that's going to be hard for them and for us to understand. So what he's going to do is, he's going to implicitly claim to be divine using the scriptures that they know and revere, as well as, and here's the kicker, guys, for part 1, through his miracles. Through his miracles. That's where you start. And this is why Ehrman can't see this. It's because for him, it's a default that the miracles are unhistorical. So he doesn't actually factor them in to his reconstruction of who Jesus was. He just assumes, well, those don't happen, so let's look at the remaining data and see if he claims to be divine. But think about it. If you're going to become man and you're God, you think you might give people a reason to notice that, hey, this guy's a little different from everybody else, right? Do you think miracles might be factored in? I mean, I know Ehrman's an atheist, but he was a theist for a long time, so pretend you're God for a second, although not too long because it's blasphemy, right? So you're God, right? And you're going to become man. Is it going to be enough to simply go around saying, hey, I'm God, trust me? Or are you going to need to give people motives of credibility to believe that something of that magnitude is true about you as opposed to all the other human beings? Especially if you're not just divine, but you're fully human as well. And you have to take naps in the boat. Okay? So, you see what I'm getting at here? So, this has only recently dawned on me that in a sense, one of the reasons the quest for the historical Jesus seems so hell-bent, no pun intended, on insisting Jesus is merely a human is precisely because I've been working on this lately because I'm doing another book on this. I'm doing a big scholarly book on this issue. Is that from the beginning, the miracles are off the table. And they're the primary motives of credibility for believing Jesus' divinity. So we're already we're stacking the deck, basically. All right? We're changing the rules here. Anyway, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at 3 miracles in which Jesus claims to be divine, and only in the synoptics. We're not going to look at John, just the synoptics. Number 1, we're going to look at the stilling of the storm. Number 2, my favorite, the walking on the sea. And then number 3, the transfiguration, which we don't necessarily think of as a miracle, but it is miraculous, as we'll see in a bit. Okay? So those will be our 3 main pillars. But before we do that, did you have a question?
I was just going to say, isn't it lunacy to say that, to go around saying that
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it would be lunacy to go around saying you're God and provide no proof. Although, at the same time, as we'll see when we get to the end, there is going to be an element of mystery that Jesus is not going to, he's not going to pull back the veil entirely. This isn't like the last judgment where every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. He wants to bring people to trust him. So there's going to be an element of faith involved, right? Which is not going to be the same thing as sight, right? Saints on earth have faith. We have the hope of things unseen. Now we have reasons for our faith. It's not completely blind, but it is blind in the sense that we don't have sight yet. We don't see God in his essence. Only the blessed do, right? Okay, so there is that element there. So as with all things like this, there's a half-truth built into it, okay? Well, let's look at the miracles. But yeah, it would be lunacy for him to, your point is well taken. It would be lunacy for God to expect people to believe that he's divine and show no evidence of that. That doesn't make any sense. So let's go through. Let's begin on page 35, Stilling the Storm.